Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. The Demon Cat by Ginger Winters. Adapted from a novel by William P. Barron. Why am I here in this place of madness, this house of diseased minds? Because of a cat. And it is a cat that will take me away from this place to my death. I know it. And maybe this cat will follow on to haunt me in some other world, as it has in this one. Who knows? It all began when I was a boy. A lonely boy in my grandmother's house. My grandmother had a great Siamese cat named Ming that she loved as only an old woman can love a cat. Perhaps it was because I was jealous of the love and attention my grandmother lavished on Ming. Or perhaps it was some inborn cruelty, the same impish impulse to inflict suffering on a helpless, dumb creature which I have observed in other boys. Anyway, with or without reason, I hated this self-complacent, supercilious animal that looked at me with her big blue eyes, with a look that seemed to see through and beyond me, as if I did not exist. I hated her with a hatred that could be satisfied only with her death. And I thought and brooded for hours of ways and means to bring this death about. I must be fair to myself. Ming hated me, too. I could sense it as I sat by my grandmother's chair before the fire and looked across at Ming, who lay in a chair on the opposite side. At such times I would always catch her watching me out of half-closed, almond-shaped eyes. Stealthily, furtively, never off her guard, as if she was just waiting for the opportunity to leap at me and scratch my eyes out. If she lay in my grandmother's lap and I leaned over to stroke her beautiful creamy fur, I could feel her actually shrink from my hand and let loose a low growl, suddenly biting my hand, and she would never purr as she always did when my grandmother stroked her. Sometimes I would hold her firmly on my lap and pretend that I loved her for my grandmother's sake. But as I stroked her, my hands would itch and twitch with a desire to clinch my hand in her satiny fur and with the other hand choke her until she died. And she too seemed to sense it, snarling and scratching and biting at me when grandmother wasn't looking. My hatred would become so overpowering that my breath would become hurried, my heart would beat almost to suffocation, and my face would flush. Usually my grandmother, noticing my reddened face, would glance up over her spectacles from the book she was reading and say, "What ails you, Robert? You look flushed and feverish. Perhaps the room is too warm for you. Put Ming down and run out in the air for a while." I would take Ming then, and holding her as tightly as I dared, and with my teeth clenched to restrain myself, I would put her on her cushion and go out. My grandfather had brought Ming, a little tan and black, fluffy, blue-eyed kitten, home with him in his ship from that mysterious land called Siam. And with Ming had come a strange tale of her origin, taken from an old Buddhist monastery garden nestled among age-old pines in the country now known as Thailand. About her neck was a beautifully wrought collar of flexible gold with a dragon engraved along its length, set with stones of topaz and jade. The collar was made so as to allow for expansion as the need arose, so that Ming was never without her collar from her kittenhood to adult age. In fact, the collar could not be loosened or removed. One day I wandered into the kitchen and saw the cat in Yin's arms. Yin, our Chinese cook, had sailed the 7 seas with my grandfather and now lived with us in the little apartment outside the kitchen. He loved to cook, and the cat was always with him in the kitchen. "What are the words on Ming's collar, Yin?" I asked the old man, who was always so stoically calm. In broken English he replied, "Words not for you, words good for very great cat, llama cat." "But what do the words say?" I urged. He mooned over the inscription, fingering the collar lovingly, while Ming lay passively in his arms and purred. "I can no say good in English," he explained at last. "It say, death no can do, no can die. See, when llama cat wears this collar, no can die, no can be killed." He concluded vaguely. "It say, love me, I love you. Hate me, I hate you. No can say good in English." And with this I had to be content for the time. I went to the library and checked out a book on Buddhism and found the words that were engraved on Ming's collar. They referred to a quotation from the 7th book of Buddha, which freely translated reads as follows: "That which is alive hath known death, and that which lives can never die. Death is not, there is only a changing from shape to shape, from life to life. Do me no harm. Protect me, and I will protect thee. Feed me, and I will feed thee. Love me, and I will love thee. Hate me, and I will hate thee. Slay me, and I will slay thee." I took those words to heart and stayed my hand, knowing that I could not kill my grandmother's cat without coming to danger myself. But those words did not alleviate my fear or hatred of that awful cat. One hot summer day, grandmother was sitting on the porch and stroking the cat, who was purring lazily in her lap. Occasionally the cat would open a half-closed eye that would bore right into me with a hatred that made my skin crawl. Grandmother never seemed to notice. "How did grandfather get her?" I asked. He told me that he found her in the garden of an ancient Buddhist monastery. He and his shipmates were attracted to the beautiful Siamese cats in the garden. It seemed the Buddhist monks reared these cats as a sort of religious duty. He knew I would love one, so he snuck a kitten into the pocket of his great coat and brought it home to me. There were so many of them, he assumed they would never know one was missing. But after some time, your grandfather started believing that a Buddhist curse of some sort went with Ming. He never did like this cat, and he often said he wished that he had not whisked her into the pocket of his big jacket when the priests were not looking. He seemed to think that the cat sat on his chest at night and sucked his breath away. I told him he was being silly, that she just liked to be near me. But when he died one night in his sleep, Ming was sitting there on his chest. I think she was just guarding him into the afterlife. That's what they say, you know. Myself, I don't believe in these superstitious curses and omens, grandmother said. I have always found her a great comfort and a thing to love. When she would hold out her hands to Ming, the great cat would leap in her lap and rub her head lovingly against my grandmother's neck. But after grandmother's story, I feared Ming more than ever. This fear was an intangible, elusive thing. I could not understand it or analyze it, but it was very real. If I wandered about the dim old passageways of my grandmother's huge house or explored the dusty cobwebbed rooms, there seemed always to follow after me the soft padding sound of Ming's paws. Following, always following me, but never coming near, always just beyond where I could see. If I called her to me, I would hear a low growl. It was maddening, always to hear that soft, stealthy, almost inaudible sound of padded feet, and then the growling that always seemed to follow. In my bedroom, sitting alone before the fire with the door locked and bolted, every corner of the room previously explored, the bed looked under, I would always feel that she was sitting there behind me, watching me out of vigilant blue eyes, eyes that were full of suspicion and hate. Waiting, watching, for what? I did not know. I only feared. Out of this fear grew many unreal terrors. I came to believe that Ming was waiting for a favorable chance to spring on me from behind, or when I was asleep, and to dig her great curved claws into my throat, tearing and rending it in her hate. I knew that she would land on my chest, and she would suck all the breath away from me, and I would die in my sleep. Of this I was certain. I became so possessed by this fear that I fashioned a leather collar for myself that fitted well up under my ears and around my neck. I wore this whenever I was alone in my room, and when I slept, gaining some sense of security, but no one can know the fear I suffered. My eyes would no sooner close in drowsy weariness when the stealthy padding of Ming's footsteps would begin. I could hear them coming softly up the stairs, stealing along the dark passageway to my room at the end of the hall. They stopped there because the door was locked and bolted, with my heavy dresser jammed against it as an extra precaution. I would listen intently, and I fancied I could hear a faint scratching sound at the door. Then there would rush over me all the terrors of the dark. The cold sweat of fear would exude from every pore as my imagination visualized Ming leaping through the window and, with a snarl, pouncing upon my throat with tooth and claw. I would shudder and tremble, feeling about my neck to make sure my leather collar was securely fastened. At last, unable to stand the uncertainty any longer, I would leap out of bed, turn on the light, rush to the door, frantically drag the heavy dresser to one side, and throw open the door. Nothing. The cat wasn't there. Then I would creep along the passageway to the head of the stairs and peer down into the dimly lighted hall. Nothing. The cat wasn't there. Looking fearfully over my shoulder as I went, I would go back to my room, shut the door, lock and bolt it again, push the dresser back against it, assure myself that the window was closed, and jump into bed, burying my head beneath the covers. Then I could sleep only to dream that Ming had crept softly into the room and was sucking the breath out of my body. Night after night I lived this life of cowering terror, of listening for the haunting sound of stealthy, softly padding footsteps always following me. But one day, everything changed. How sweet it was at the time, how frightful it seems now. It was bedtime, and I raced up the stairs and down the long passageway to my bedroom, shutting and locking the door as quickly as I could. Hastily undressing, throwing my clothes here and there, I plunged into the very center of the bed and buried my head beneath the covers. There I waited in shivering terror for the sound of padding footsteps. But they never came. I listened for what seemed like hours, but nothing. I finally slept. The next morning I woke refreshed for the first time in months. As I walked into the kitchen, I could tell something was wrong, though. Grandmother was sitting at the kitchen table, crying. "Grandmother, what's wrong?" I asked. Through her tears, Grandmother told me that Ming had been out hunting, as cats do, and had been hit by a car. At this, she started crying even harder, which allowed me to suppress my smile and sense of relief without her taking notice. I felt sorry for Grandmother, but I could not have been happier if I had been given $1 million. I fairly danced around the house that day. No fear, no demon cat waiting to jump out at me from behind the sofa, no maniacal howling or growling or anything. It was glorious. Yin and I helped the gardener dig a hole in which to bury the poor cat, and we carefully assisted grandmother out to the yard to say her final goodbyes. We asked if we could remove the collar before setting the cat into her grave. Grandmother said, "Certainly not. It stays with Ming." And so the cat was buried amongst grandmother's flower garden, the collar still attached. That night as dark approached, I calmly walked to my room and shut the door, not even bothering with the locks. I breathed a big sigh of relief and happiness as I sunk into my pillow, looking forward to the silence of the night. I closed my eyes and drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Suddenly, my eyes bolted open. What was it I heard? The moonlight was shining in from the open window, and I thought I saw 2 fiery eyes glaring at me. Was I in the clutches of a nightmare? Or had I, in my haste to get to bed, neglected to shut the window? Suddenly, the big cat leaped from the window right onto the bed. I sat frozen, shivering with terror, as the big cat stared into my eyes. What was that around her neck? A collar? Ming's collar? How could it be? Ming was dead. We had buried it in the garden. How could she be here on my bed? The great cat slouched into a poise of attack, ready to leap, a low growl coming from her throat. I screamed. A live and famished, man-eating tiger in the room could not have inspired me with greater terror. I swung my arm to knock the great cat away and felt the claws tear into my skin. I fled down the stairs, stumbling over furniture in the lower hall until I reached the cook's room. Here I knocked and begged, with chattering teeth, to be allowed to remain on the couch in his room until morning, telling him I had been frightened by a dreadful dream. Early the next morning I stole into the kitchen, watching carefully for any glimpse of Ming. Yin was waiting there, a cup of coffee in his hands, an anxious look on his face. "Master Robert, no wonder that you could not sleep last night. Your poor grandmother passed away in the night. It must have been some time after midnight, for I had checked in on her at around 11. I cried out, not for surprise or grief at my grandmother's death. That was a thing to be expected, for she was very old and hadn't been well these last few weeks. Nor was it for the joy in knowing I was now the heir of a wealthy fortune that my grandparents had accumulated over the course of their lifetime. My inheritance would be a thing of little worth if I must spend anxious days and fear-haunted nights in the house with a ghost cat. No, I thought only of Ming and the dread of her return and the terror I had experienced in the night. How strange that my grandmother's passing and the return of the demon cat had coincided. My grandmother had been my guardian since I was a very young boy. My parents had been killed in a terrible accident. We were living in India. My father was a traveling doctor, a highly sought-after surgeon, and my mother was a nurse. They both had a love of exotic cultures and would spend a year in one country or another, establishing medical clinics in remote areas. One day, a giant tiger had wandered into the village and into the clinic where my mother and father were working. They never saw it coming, and I never saw them again. Terror filled my mind as I slowly walked back to my room. Would the cat be there, waiting still, ready to leap and devour me? Was it an apparition of the night? How could I stay within these walls another day? Gratefully, Yin could sense my fear, and thinking that it was because I didn't want to stay in the house where my grandmother had passed, he arranged for me to stay with friends of his in the city who had a son my age. I was free at last. free from the fear of claws and teeth in my quivering throat, free from the sound of softly padding feet. I started at a new school and quickly became best friends with my new brother. We shared a room in their little apartment, which was wonderful. I didn't have to be alone any longer. Soon the memory of Ming was fading into the distance, and I was a new boy. In the years that followed, Yin stayed on at grandmother's house as caretaker. I did not return again to the house of my inheritance until I was a young man, freshly graduated from college, and with my new bride, a soft, shy, pretty little thing with big blue eyes. I was very happy, wealthy, and married to a loving and beautiful girl whom I adored. I looked forward to a long life of peace and happiness. We decided to move to the country on the grand estate that had been my inheritance. We arranged for housekeepers, gardeners, and a cook to prepare for our arrival. But from the very day of my return to the accursed estate of my grandmother, there was a change. What was it? I do not know, but I could feel it. I could sense it the very first day. A subtle feeling, a sense of gloom, intangible, elusive and baffling, began slowly to settle over me, stifling and suffocating the happiness that had been mine before returning to the big home of my inheritance. I had come from the village with some trifle of household necessity. Returning, I sought out my wife and found her in my grandmother's old room, standing before the life-sized portrait of Ming, done in oil for my grandmother by a great artist who had also loved cats. Until that day, Ming had remained only a dim memory of my fear-driven youth. Purposely, I had put all thought of her out of my mind. But now it all returned, a horde of hateful memories, as I stood there in the open door and saw my wife standing and gazing up at the likeness of the great cat. And as she turned, startled at my entrance, what did I see? I saw, or thought I saw, a likeness, a great likeness between the two. Her great blue eyes, her silky hair, the feline expression. Why had I not noticed it before? "You frightened me, Robert," she laughed. "The look on your face, what is it?" "Nothing," I answered, "nothing at all." I reached out to give her a hug. Did she shrink from my caress? Did her body tremble in my arms? Or was it my imagination, the stirring of old memories of Ming, who shrank from my lightest touch? As the day wore on, I grew restless and uneasy, ill at ease and dissatisfied. After dinner, I went for a long walk along the country road. When I returned, my wife was asleep. I lay down softly beside her, and, tired out by my long walk, was soon asleep myself. Asleep, I dreamed of Ming. So vivid and so real was the dream that I awoke with a cry of the cat in my ears, and as I awoke, I seemed to hear it again, very plainly, subdued, a half-cat, half-human howl. And my wife was gone. I sprang up hastily. The moonlight was streaming through the window. It was almost as light as day. She was nowhere in the room. I went swiftly down the hall and descended the stairs, making no noise with my bare feet. The door of my grandmother's room was open. I looked in. 2 luminous blue eyes glowed out at me from the semi-darkness of the far corner. For an instant my heart stood still and then raced palpitatingly on. I took a deep breath and went toward the unknown thing with glowing eyes that crouched in the corner. As I reached the pool of moonlight in the center of the room, I heard a gasp of fear, a sudden movement, and my wife fled past me, out of the room and up the stairs. I heard the bedroom door slam behind her, heard the key turn in the lock. As she rushed past me and up the stairs, the patter of her feet fell on my ears like the soft padding of Ming's footsteps that had filled my youthful years with fear. My blood chilled at this old, until now, forgotten sound. The slamming of the bedroom door, the turning of the key in the lock, roused in me an overwhelming fury. Was I to be locked out of my own bedroom? Our bedroom? I rushed up the stairs. Angrily, I knocked on the door. I pounded with my fists on the panels. I shouted, "Open! Open this door!" In the midst of my furious onslaught, the door suddenly opened, and a sleepy little figure stood aside to allow me to enter. "What's going on?" she exclaimed. "What's the matter? Where have you been? I was sound asleep and you frightened me, shouting and pounding at the door. Why didn't you just walk in?" Was I deceived? Partly. But her eyes, in her eyes was that sly, inscrutable, cat-like look that I had never seen there until this day. "What were you doing downstairs, alone, in my grandmother's room?" I stammered. "And why did you lock the door?" She arched her brows incredulously. "What are you talking about? Me? Robert, what is wrong with you? I just this moment awoke from a sound sleep because you were banging on the door. It wasn't even locked. How could I be downstairs?" "But the bedroom door was locked," I yelled. "You must have locked it yourself then," she exclaimed. "It definitely wasn't me." Somehow I knew, beyond a reasonable doubt, that she was lying. I knew I had been fully awake and in my right senses when I had gone downstairs and found her there. Evidently she desired to deceive me, and until I could fathom her motive, I would just have to pretend to believe her. So, muttering something to the effect that she must be right, we got back into bed. But I couldn't sleep. Forcing its way into my harried mind was my old youthful fear of the dark, and I thought back on all those terror-haunted days when I dwelt in fear of Ming. Lying there in the dark, I resolved that we should move from this ghastly place, no matter how grand an estate it was. I finally fell asleep. I slept far into the next day, awakening at noon to find my wife had gone out with some of our neighbors for a game of tennis. And since it was daylight, the terrors of the night seemed unreal, silly, half-forgotten nightmares. So I dismissed the subject from my mind for the time being and set out for a long walk across the fields. It was near dinner time when I returned. As I opened the door of the dining room, my wife turned from where she stood by the fireplace to greet me, and I was again struck by her resemblance to Ming. She seemed upset. "Robert," she said, "don't you remember what day this is?" I shook my head no. "Really?" she asked with a hurt look on her face. "It's my birthday. I can't believe you forgot my birthday. It's my 21st birthday. Really, Robert, you should have remembered." I noticed that she was dressed up, that her hair was curled, and she was wearing jewelry. Jewelry? What was that around her neck? My eyes widened in terror as I took in the sight of her necklace. It was a collar of flexible gold with a dragon engraved along its length, together with many Chinese characters and set with stones of topaz and jade. It was identical to the collar Ming had worn all those years ago. "No!" I screamed. "I forbid you to wear that accursed thing." I ran to her, tried to pry it from her neck, and she gazed at me with terror in her eyes. And then she snarled, no, growled at me. I seized her by her beautiful throat. I meant to choke her until those cruel blue eyes started from their sockets. But I was cheated. The housekeeper and gardener, upon hearing her screams, overpowered me and pulled me away. My wife ran to the bedroom where she locked herself in. And the next day, I was arrested and brought here to the sanatorium. I told them I was perfectly sane. I say it again now. I've told them that every day all these years since I was brought here. And every day my sweet, cooing-voiced wife comes daily to see me. She kisses me with soft, lying lips that long to suck my breath away, or perhaps even rend the flesh of my throat with her little sharp white teeth. I know she'll be the end of me one of these days. In the morning, the orderlies making their rounds opened the door of the old man in room 112. On the bed lay the man, glassy-eyed, with fallen jaw and livid face, dead. On his breast crouched a great Siamese blue-eyed cat who faced them with an arched back and menacing snarl. Involuntarily they drew back. The cat sprang past them and down the passageway to the stairs, uttering an unearthly howl. "My God!" gasped the nurse with pallid lips. "Did you see that? Around the cat's neck, the collar. It was gold with topaz and jade jewels."